With this video, we begin a new series, an introduction to Aristotle, beginning with his basic metaphysical and epistemological works. Aristotle was a Macedonian, not an Athenian Greek by birth. He was sent to study in Plato's academy when he was 17. He's known for being more interested than Plato and many of his disciples in the empirical aspects of study. After Plato's death, he left Athens, and after a few years, he became the royal tutor to Alexander the Great in the court of Philip of Macedon. After the death of Philip, he returned to Athens and founded his own school nearby, which was known as the Lyceum. It was at this point that he began writing most of his major works. Only a small percentage of Aristotle's writing survived, but what did shows immense variety. When Alexander the Great died, Aristotle was forced by anti-Macedonian prejudice to leave Athens once again. While he was deeply influenced by Plato, Aristotle's approach to philosophy is starkly different. Whereas Plato favored highly abstract and transcendental types of inquiries, Aristotle preferred to remain rooted in the concrete empirical world. Because of this, concrete sensible particulars play a much more significant role in Aristotle's philosophy than they do in Plato's. We see this right from the beginning. In the early work that is the usual starting point for a study of Aristotle, the categories, or predicates, as it might be translated. This is a work that gave its name to an important philosophical concept, the concept of a category. A scheme of categories is an exhaustive account of the most general classes of entities. Since Aristotle, the cataloging of the categories has been linked to the project of giving an ontology. An ontology. What is an ontology? An ontology is, in short, a theory of being, or a complete inventory of everything that is. A theory of being, or a complete inventory of everything that is. Of course, this isn't a complete inventory of everything in its particularity or its individuality, because that would be impractical, but rather a complete inventory of the types or classes or highest kinds of beings, so that one can have a kind of overview or conspectus of everything that is. Ontology without the indefinite article is a science of being, the science of being in general, but typically when people speak of an ontology, they're speaking of a particular account of what is, the types of things that are. So one can ask, what is your ontology? Do you include the supernatural, for example, in your ontology? Do you include the immaterial or anything that's immaterial in your ontology? Do you include things like numbers or sets, mathematical entities in your ontology? That's the way it's used. Thus, the categories is a kind of answer to a very fundamental question. What is there? A main issue in this area of philosophy is whether the categories describe reality as it is in itself, or merely in our thoughts or language. If it merely describes our thoughts or language, then there's a question about whether the categories refer to real objects or merely possible objects. And so we get fundamental division here between categorical realism which says that categories really do inhere in reality, or categorical idealism, which says that categories are just forms of the mind. And often the second view is associated with the idea that the kind of ontology that Aristotle is giving here really can never be anything more than a kind of description of our conceptual scheme, as it's described, our conceptual scheme, the kind of schema or schematic that we have inherent in our mind of the structure of reality. And this is a position, idealism, that's often associated with the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whereas categorical realism is usually standardly taken to be Aristotle's position. Okay, so this is a brief work, so it shouldn't take too much time to explicate it. And a lot of it is material that doesn't perhaps require a great deal of commentary. It's rather straightforward. Aristotle begins the categories with a discussion of the significance of things having a name in common. So sometimes things have a name in common, but different definitions. And these things are, he says, homonymous. So a human and a drawing are both animals. This plays upon the particular features of the Greek language that are noted in the footnote in our text. But in English, we might say something like, well, the stem of a tree and a storage compartment in the rear of a car are both trunks. They have the name in common, but these things are defined differently. So that's what he would describe as homonymous. So just this, from a word that just means having the same name. Other times, things have a name in common and also the same definition corresponding to the name. And these things are synonymous. So human and ox are both animals. So Aristotle is here then giving an account of what really matters when things share a name in common. What matters is that they share the definition in common, not merely that they say that they share the same name. You can look at him as saying something like that. What matters is the account that's given of the things and the way in which that is in common. And you might think this perhaps has some implications for Plato's famous one over many argument that says that if things have the same name, if they're called by the same name, they must share something in common. Well, Aristotle here is implicitly saying that's not the case. There are things that share the same name that do not have anything in common other than the name. And then finally he says there are things that are paronymus, when one thing gets its name from another via some change in grammatical form. So the grammarian gets his name from grammar, the brave man from bravery, and so forth. Why does the categories begin this way? Well, I suggested it may be a part, a kind of rejoinder to Plato and the one over many argument. It certainly suggests an acknowledgement that sometimes, but not always, language is a guide to being. Language is a guide to being. And that principle is one that does seem to be particularly noteworthy about Aristotle's approach to ontology. He does seem to implicitly be adhering to this idea that language is a guide to being. This is, in many ways, as much a characteristic of Aristotle's style as anything else. His style or his approach to philosophy, to trust language in this way. And we might ask whether this is a good practice or not a good practice, but at any rate, that does seem to be a presupposition. It's not something he necessarily argues for, but rather it seems to be a kind of a starting point of his approach to things. Not that Aristotle necessarily thinks that language always has to be a guide to being. Even the idea of homonyms, it suggests that that's not necessarily the case. But as a general rule, or as a general approach, he does seem to hold that language is a guide to being. It would seem that Aristotle mainly wants to make the point here that names express a common reality among things only when names are used in the same sense. This is certainly a necessary, although perhaps not a very exciting or interesting point to make. But if you're going to rely upon word usage as a guide to ontology, then they must have stable definitions. Okay, so this brings us to chapter 2 of the categories. His first scheme of classification of the things that are is given in chapter 2. First, he separates out from the things that are said, those things that are said in combination from those that are not. The point seems to be that the things that there are will be said without combination. So in the first paragraph there, among the things that are said, some are said in combination, some without combination. Examples of things said in combination are man runs, man wins. Examples of things said without combination are man, ox, runs, wins. And we might be taken aback here and think, wait, is this philosophy? Are we back in kindergarten class? What's going on here? But the point he seems to be making here, and this is, I think, an indication of his adherence to this principle, language as a guide to being, that he's taking for granted that the joining of the subject term and the predicate term in language are a combination, meaning that a subject-predicate combination cannot itself be a single category. So the categories are going to be those things that are said without combination, in the sense that they aren't compounds, they are sort of atoms, if you will, of meaning and a corresponding reality, a reality corresponding to that meaning. That seems to be the point. So Aristotle's initial fourfold classification of entities relies upon a key distinction. This is the distinction between what is said of a subject and what is in a subject. What is said of a subject and what is in a subject. So these are very basic notions, so it's difficult to explicate them in a way that is more basic. But again, we observe the importance of the linguistic approach to ontology, that what is said of a subject has a kind of ontological status that actually is, for Aristotle, going to be higher, that is belonging to what's more real than what is in a subject. What is in a subject, Aristotle explains that this means, quoting him here, what is in something not as a part and cannot exist separately from what it is in. And that's, of course, not really a definition, because he uses the word in a couple times in defining what he means by being in. But this idea of cannot exist separately, that seems to be at least something noteworthy. What is in a subject cannot exist separately from what it is in. So this is what is known in the tradition, it seems, as an accident or an accidental property. And this is, of course, a technical term. We don't mean accident in the sense in which you had a car accident, but there is a relation between these notions, because the car accident is something that didn't have to happen and doesn't have to occur, doesn't have to be part of the universe, so to speak. And something of that sense of accident is meant here, that it's something that exists in something but doesn't have to be there, in the sense that if you remove an accident or accidental property from a thing, then that thing could still retain its being or its essence. It could still be what it is, even if you remove the property. So, for example, the whiteness of a man's hair. If a man decides he's going to be vain and dye his hair black, the accident of whiteness would be removed, but the man would stay a man, his hair would stay hair, and so forth. There wouldn't be any essential change. So this is contrasted with the essence or the essential. The essence of something that's essential, which suggests, of course, that this contrasting notion of what is said of a thing is going to have more to do with this notion of the essence. Later in chapter 5 of the categories, Aristotle makes the point that the things in a subject can be predicated of the subject, but the definition of things in a subject will never be predicated of a subject. So, for example, white, which is in a subject, in a body, is predicated of the subject, for the body is called white, but the definition of white will never be predicated of the body. And so you see this idea here that definitions have more to do with the essence of a thing. It's what's predicated of the subject itself. Whereas the accident, the thing that's merely in the thing, is not is not going to be predicated of the subject. Its definition, rather, is not going to be predicated of the subject. It will be predicated of the subject, but its definition will not be predicated of the subject. So this is, of course, an entirely grammatical, linguistic observation, but Aristotle takes it to have ontological import in terms of the relative ontological import and weight to be assigned to different things based on whether they are said of a thing or whether they are in a thing. And so this basic distinction between what is said of and what is in generates 4 possibilities. So we get, depending on how we combine them. So the first is beings that are said of and not in. Beings that are said of a thing but not in a thing. And this is what Aristotle calls secondary substances. For example, man. Which is meant something, either manhood or humanity, depending on how you're interpreting this, either as the male or the human. So secondary substances, these are something like the genera of things and species of things. So not a man, but the genus man, the class of man. The second is beings that are not said of anything, but that are in a thing. So these would be non-substantial particulars. And the example here he gives is a piece of grammatical knowledge, which is kind of maybe a bit of an awkward example, but so we might go back to the idea of, let's say, the whiteness of a man. Socrates is white, or Socrates is musical. Should take another standard example. That is the musicalness or the grammatical knowledge that's in that particular man, not grammatical knowledge in general or musical knowledge in general or musicality in general or whiteness in general, but the piece that's in that particular. So it's a particular thing that's in a particular substance. Then there are things that are said of and in. And these are non-substantial universals. For example, knowledge. So knowledge in general, which isn't a substance, but it's a universal thing, or whiteness in general, any kind of non-substantial universal. And then we have primary substances, which is, as the name suggests, the key category. That's why we'll put a star by it. This is the key category for Aristotle. And unfortunately for the key category, I've kind of run out of board here. So you'll forgive me, I'll put something right over here. So the primary substances are something like an individual man or an individual horse. A couple favorite examples. So primary substances are things that are neither said of nor in anything. So these are the four classifications, the four classes, the fourfold classification of being that arises from this distinction between what's said of a thing and what is in a thing. We get secondary substances, things that are said of but are not in a thing. We get non-substantial particulars, things that are not said of anything but that are in a thing, like a specific piece of grammatical knowledge. We get things that are said of and in or non-substantial particulars, like knowledge in general. And then beings that are neither said of a thing nor in anything, and those are primary substances. So Aristotle says it this way. Okay, so in the third chapter, Aristotle says, whenever one thing is predicated of another as of a subject, everything said of what is predicated will also be said of the subject. Whenever one thing is predicated of another as a subject, everything said of what is predicated will also be said of the subject. For example, man is predicated of the individual man, and animal is predicated of man. Therefore, animal will also be predicated of the individual man, for the individual man is both a man and an animal. And then Aristotle lays out his theory of classification, as this is related to the grammatical function of predication. So he says, differentiae of genera that are different and not subordinate to one another are also different in kind. For example, differentiae of animal and of knowledge. For the differentiae of animal are footed, winged, aquatic, and two-footed, but none of these is a differentiae of knowledge. One sort of knowledge does not differ from another by being two-footed. Yet if one genus is subordinate to another, nothing prevents their differentiae from being the same. For the higher genera are predicated of those beneath them, so that all differentiae of what is predicated will be different of the subject as well. So what he's got in mind here is that things can be predicated of an individual thing or of a universal. So an example of the first case, man is predicated of the individual man, Socrates, say. An example of the second case, things predicated of a universal, animal is predicated of man. So we can say Socrates is a man, that's predicating man of Socrates. But then man, we can also predicate something of that. We can predicate animal of man. And everything that is predicated of a universal is also predicated of the individual thing that the universal is predicated of. So the man Socrates is an animal. Aristotle divides universals into genus and differentia. So a genus is a higher level class. And this is relative. A class may be a differentiator of one class while being a genus of another. So dog is a differentiator of animal while being a genus relative to beagle. And the least general genus is the species, but genera may be arranged in a hierarchy of increasing generality. A hierarchical system of genus and species results in a taxonomic classification in which differentia of different non-subordinate genera are also different in kind. So you're going to get, just do this kind of abstractly here. So you have a situation where you have one level of generality, you have different genuses, let's just genera. And then you have different subordinate genuses under this, or genera. And then maybe these have different species under it. And so, we just make one example, use one of the center ones here. So let's suppose one of this is something like animal, man, and Socrates. So these G's are just standing for different genera, genuses or genera, use the proper Latin plural. And for an example of this, these are just placeholders, variables that could stand for different genera. An example of this would be animal, and then you have below that, let's say the species man, and an individual, Socrates. And Aristotle's point is that, and then, by the way, this shouldn't be taken necessarily to be the way that Aristotle would classify things. This is just an illustration. In fact, ultimately, I think it wouldn't be the way necessarily Aristotle would understand the way these are arranged, but this is just meant to be an illustration here. So whatever is going to be attached to animal is the definition. Whatever is going to be said of animal as its definition is also going to apply to the things below it in the hierarchy. So it's going to apply to man, and it's going to apply to Socrates. So whatever is said of animal will apply to Socrates. But then there are these branches, so that things that are said in this other, these other genuses over here. So we might, it's natural, of course, to think, okay, maybe this is something like plant over here, right? Suggesting that this might be living thing or something up here. So in that case, what's said of these species over here is going to be different from what's said of these species over here because it belongs to a different branch. That's the point he's making. So as you move down the chain of generality, the definitions that obtain of the higher level genera are going to apply to the things below it, but they're not going to apply to things in the other branches. So this suggests a kind of structure of reality that Aristotle is suggesting here. And of course, this is very commonplace for us now, especially in biology. We think of this all the time, but Aristotle is coming up with these ideas in his day. Okay, so moving on then, next in chapter 4 of the categories, Aristotle discusses the 10 distinct kinds of things that are said. And these are what is most commonly referred to as Aristotle's categories, the 10 categories. The ta legomena, the things said, or things spoken of. Things said or things spoken of. So what are these 10? Aristotle gives the list, which is quite clearly presented in our text. This is around 1b, line 25 beginning, and on page 453 in our text, continuing to 454. But still worth, I think, writing these out so we can look at them. So the first is substance. And the example of that is a man or a horse. Substance, a man or a horse. A question that arises about this is this meant to be a category that only applies to organisms? He mentions 2 living organisms. I mean, even just 2 animals. And if so, what about, things like inanimate or non-organic individuals like rocks? Do they count? And if they don't count, why don't they count? But for now, he doesn't answer these questions. Second is going to be the category of quantity. For example, 2 cubits, 3 cubits. So it seems like he has the idea of some definite measure that's involved here. Of course, there's questions that can be raised about this, whether the quantity is something that has to be a kind of quality that can be aggregated, or whether quantity includes divisions of things as well. That is to say, whether it could be, increasing and decreasing. It would seem so. Whether it has to be in terms of some definite unit or not. These are some of the questions that could arise with regard to quantity. Quality. For example, white or grammatical. So it's natural for us to think of the qualitative as the non-quantitative. So things that can't be given a definite or exact measure. But that's not the way Aristotle understands it here. It just gives these examples. And it's not clear exactly, what do white and grammatical have in common with one another. So that it is a bit murky, a bit obscure as to what exactly is going to constitute qualities here. Fourth is relative. For example, double, half, larger. And it's worth noting here that, so this category is relative, it's not relation. That is, it's not going to be like next to. In fact, he has other categories that seem to fit that more closely, like the category of being arranged fits that more closely, the idea of next to, or perhaps even where, the next category. This is seems to be the idea that if something contains something in it, that it contains only because of something else, that there's something in it that points to something else. That is, it's half of this other thing. So there's got to be this other thing that makes it half. Something like that. The fifth one is where. So in the Lyceum, in the marketplace. That one seems pretty straightforward. Where, when, yesterday, last year. When, again, pretty straightforward. Then 7, being arranged. So the idea here is being arranged like in a position. For example, lying or sitting. Are these just spatial categories being arranged? Could it also be temporal categories being arranged across time in a certain way? Like if we actually think of a musical arrangement, which is across time, not in space. So that's a question that might arise about that seventh one. The eighth is having on. For example, wearing shoes, being armed. Wearing shoes and being armed. Certainly this is something that is said of something that is armed or it's wearing shoes. Doing is the next one. That is to say, acting. For example, cutting or burning. And it's interesting that these examples are examples of an agent acting on something else, cutting it, burning it. So it's unclear whether that's the way Aristotle's understanding this category, in which case it would seem like it would just be a subset of action as such, because you might think at least that there are actions that aren't actions that are doing anything to anything else, like dancing, for example, or spinning or whatever. But these are the examples he gives us. So again, it's not answered here. And then being affected, being acted upon. Like being cut or being burnt. Being burned. So there you have it. Our 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relative, where, when, being arranged, or in a position, having on, doing, or being affected. And one thing that leaps out at us about this is how, first of all, the keynote seems to be set by this first one. And in particular, if you think of a man or a horse, you can imagine that things are being said of a man or a horse under all of these different categories. The horse is, 3 cubits long or whatever. I'm not exactly sure how long a cubit is. The horse is white, and the man is grammatical. The horse is double the man's size. The horse is in the marketplace. The man is in the marketplace. When the man was in the marketplace yesterday, what was he doing there? He was lying down. He was sitting. Was he wearing shoes? No, he was barefoot. Socrates was known for liking to go barefoot. What was he doing? Well, he was cutting. He was carving something. So all these, if you sort of naively look at these, you might be excused for drawing the conclusion that Socrates is, or Aristotle rather, is devising these categories in response to the various types of questions that might be asked of a man. And so there's a kind of assumption built into this that the central ontological category is this first one, the category of substance, which includes a man or a horse. And all these other categories are just ways of speaking of substance, things that can be said of substance. And there are certainly indications that this is, something like this is what Aristotle is doing, but he doesn't explicitly say that's what he's doing. So it's a bit of a speculation to draw that conclusion. This leads to the first discussion question. Apparently, Aristotle's list of categories, this list is intended to provide a complete inventory of the most basic kinds of things there are. Does it succeed in doing this? How do you think Aristotle would argue for its completeness? For example, does there seem to be any principle or method underlying the development of this list? Or does it seem to have been assembled haphazardly? Is there anything that Aristotle leaves off this list that should have been included? And then, of course, as always, explain your answer. So once again, Aristotle's list of categories is intended to provide a complete inventory of the most basic kinds of things there are. Here it is. Does it succeed in providing a complete inventory of what there is? How do you think Aristotle would argue for its completeness? Does there seem to be any principle or method underlying the development of this list, or does it seem to be assembled haphazardly? Is there anything that Aristotle leaves off the list that should have been included? Okay. So finally, chapter 5, long chapter, he begins this chapter with a distinction between primary and secondary substances. Primary and secondary substances. So primary substances, as the name suggests, are the most fundamental category, for Aristotle. These are individual things. Individual things. So on page 454, beginning of chapter 5, he says, substance in the most proper sense of the word, that which is primarily and most of all called substance, is neither said of any subject nor is it in any subject. For example, the individual man and the individual horse. So neither said of nor in any subject. And the example is man or horse. By which we mean the individual man or horse. What are called secondary substances are both the species which the things primarily called substances fall under and the genera of these species. So these are the species and genera that primary substances fall under. And so, for example, this would be the species man, horse, genus animal, and so forth. That's the secondary substances. So we get here a kind of distinction between particular things and universals. But in calling these the primary, we have to note a very important fact, namely, Aristotle here is implying a rejection of Platonism. To say that these are the primary substances and these are substances only in a secondary sense quite clearly is a rejection of Plato's position. For Aristotle, it seems the more particular is going to be more real than the less particular. The opposite of Plato's view, who favors the abstract and the general over the concrete and the particular. Substance is primary being, and all other things are beings because they relate to the primary being. He makes this quite clear in the continuation, a couple of paragraphs down. We're now on the right-hand column of page 454, towards the top. All other things are either said of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. All other things are either said of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. This is evident from a consideration of cases. For example, animal is predicated of man and therefore of the individual man. For if it were predicated of no individual man, it would not be predicated of man at all. Again, color is in body and therefore in an individual body. For if it were not in any individual, it would not be in any body at all. Thus, all other things are either said of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. Therefore, if there were no primary substances, there could not be anything else. If there were no primary substances, there were no individual particular things like horses or men, there could be nothing else. So this quite clearly states Aristotle's view of the ontological primacy of concrete, sensible, particular things. In particular, it seems, things like organisms like men and horses over other things. Concrete individual substances underlie the species in genera, ontologically speaking. If there weren't particular individual men or horses, there'd be no such thing as man itself or horse itself. So the species in genera are in a real sense about such primary substances. And without such substances as these would have no ground for being. And the same holds of the things that are in, so these particular non-substantial things like whiteness or grammatical. Particular instance of being white, like the whiteness of Socrates, could exist and can exist only because there is such a thing as Socrates. There is a particular substance. Now, to us, this might seem rather obvious and straightforward, but of course, within the context of Platonism, this is a contrarian, you might say, perspective to take. Aristotle goes on to say that among secondary substances, the species is more a substance than the genus. Remember, the species is, of course, the more specific class than a genus. So the species is more a substance than the genus. Why? Because it's closer to the primary substance. So we see here the opposite of Plato's view. The closer a thing is to concreteness, the closer it is to being. But how does Aristotle justify this departure from Plato? There seem to be a number of reasons that he gives. So we can kind of try to keep track of these. Ask the question, why is primary substance primary? Or in other words, why are the concrete individual things regarded as being primary by Aristotle? So the first main part of his justification is given in this passage on the bottom of page 454. He says, further, primary substances are subjects for all other things, and all other things are predicated of them or are in them. It is for this reason that they are called substances most of all. I'll read that again. Primary substances are subjects for all other things, and all other things are predicated of them or are in them, and it is for this reason that they are called substances most of all. So the first reason seems to be that they stand in the subject position in the sentence. They stand in the subject position, and all the other things are attached to them or predicated of them. So we can say, we speak of like the horse being gray. We don't say gray is the horse. I mean, if you say something like that, you're speaking sort of poetically, right? But this isn't normally, we understand this to be just a kind of poetic rearrangement of the proper ordering of these things, which is to place the horse in the subject position and say, well, the grayness is in the horse. And even if we would say something like that is a horse, and we're referring to a horse, let's say a horse named Trigger, This suggests the way in which the secondary substance is spoken of particular things. They're in the subject position. And it's true in a secondary way, we can say things like, horses run fast, and make a general statement about horses, but that statement, it piggybacks on certain things that we would say about Trigger and Silver and Mr. Ed, and maybe not Mr. Ed, but other horses, right? These sorts of statements are not basic. That statements about the particular individuals are basic. So this is the first point, that they stand in the subject position. Also, Aristotle notes that, quote, each substance seems to signify a particular this. That's the second point. Seems to signify a particular this. This indicates that a primary substance is going to be individual and one in number. Something that is individual and one. So I can point and I can say this thing, right? This man here, that one there, that horse there. It seems that secondary substances also signify a particular this. But it's not really so. If asked what a cat is, we might point to a cat and say, that's a cat. But we're not pointing to the species cat. We're just merely using the cat as an example of the species. So concrete particulars can also stand for their species in those sorts of examples, but I can't really point to the species cat. Like I can point to Maximilian as a particular cat. Now, why should this matter, being able to point? Certainly Plato didn't think so, but Aristotle seems to be pointing to the kind of tangibility, the kind of concreteness that primary substances have, individual things have. You can point to it and say this. He further remarks that no primary substance is more a substance than any other, nor is any species more a species than any other. And again, this is a contrast with Plato, who sees some forms as more real or more substantial than another. But, Brent isn't any more substantial than Maximilian. Man isn't any more substantial than cat as a species. They all have a kind of ontological equality. But why does Aristotle consider only species and genera to be secondary substances? His answer seems to be that if pointing to a particular horse with gray hair, I were to ask, what is it? It would count as an answer to say it is an animal, but not to say gray-haired. If I say, well, what is that? Pointing at a horse, what is it? An animal, okay. Gray-haired, that doesn't capture what it is. The answer gray-haired it doesn't explain what it is or the essence of a thing. A still better answer than saying animal would be to say horse. The answer in terms of its species is closer to the primary substance, and thus it constitutes a better answer to the question, what is it? For Aristotle, the essence, or what it is of an individual, is given by the species and genera. So, in a sense, they reveal the primary substance. Furthermore, as primary substances are to everything, he says, so species and genera all are to all the rest, for all the rest are predicated of these. Just as nothing exists except in relation to primary substances, according to Aristotle, so too no non-substantial property, such as being white or grammatical, exists except in relation to a species or genus. However, it seems that they may relate to multiple distinct species. White does. Of course, there can be white horses, white men, and so forth. But the point is that they don't exist except in relation to a species of substance. And finally, for Aristotle, each species and genus signifies a particular sort of substance. So there's a tight conceptual connection between primary and secondary substances. So that's why he considers, it seems, species and genera to be secondary substances. They alone reveal primary substances. That is to say that they tell us what it is. If we point to the species or the genera, we point to a particular thing, and we're thinking of or trying to exemplify through that thing what a particular species is. We're getting at a kind of revelation of what the essence of that thing is. So species and genera have a different status from mere accidental properties, like having gray hair. They're not in the subject. That is, they don't inhere in things accidentally, such that they might be taken away and the thing would remain. If you take away the horse from Seabiscuit, there is no more Seabiscuit. Unlike if you take away the speed from Seabiscuit or the mane from Seabiscuit, or even if he loses a leg, he's still a horse. But if you take the horsiness away from Seabiscuit, there is no more Seabiscuit. Aristotle suggests, however, that the parts of a substance are not themselves substances, since they are in a subject. This suggests that, well, the ears or the tail or the hoofs of a horse are parts of a horse. They're not themselves substances, for they are in the horse. Substance for Aristotle, at least in the primary sense, is not mere material stuff. It appears to involve things that are held together as a kind of organic unity, as the limbs of a living being are. Primary substances are given a definition in terms of both their species and their genus. Species are defined in terms of their genus and their differentia. So, for example, within the genus animal, man is differentiated by being rational, and kind of classic Aristotelian definition. Aristotle goes on to discuss several features that characterize substances. So we can make another list here of features of substances. First, they do not have a contrary. Do not have a contrary. So nothing is contrary, the contrary of an individual man. In the way that with qualities, of course, you have, wet being the contrary of dry, or white being the contrary of black, etc. There's no contrary to Socrates. But Aristotle notes that this is not unique to substances. It's a feature of substances, but it's not unique to it, because quantities also don't have a contrary. So what would be the contrary of 10? Right? There are other numbers, of course, besides 10, but 10 qubits or whatever. But it's not as if 9 qubits is the contrary of 10 qubits. So it's not the only thing that doesn't have contrary, but substances don't have contraries. Second, substance does not admit of more or less. Does not admit of more or less. No substance is said to be more or less than just what it is. So one man is not more a man than any other man. One horse is not more a horse than the other horse. And this is in contrast with, say, an instance of white. A particular instance of white might be whiter than another instance, as in a detergent ad. You can look at my, which is whiter, the whiteboard or my undershirt. It looks like the undershirt's whiter than this white, right? So white can be whiter than another white, but a man can't be more a man than another man, ontologically speaking. Maybe socially speaking or something, of course, rhetorically speaking. And then third, there's what is most characteristic of substance, according to Aristotle, which is that something one and the same in number can receive contraries. So it is something one and the same in number yet can receive contraries. Substance seems to be unique in this respect. And this is why he says this is most characteristic of substance. We could give a little star to this one since this is the most characteristic one. Something one and the same in number can receive contraries. One and the same instance of color cannot be white and black. One and the same action cannot be good and bad. But one and the same man can be white and black at particular different times. For example, a coal miner, a white coal miner is black when he comes out, in a sense of black. One and the same action cannot be good or bad, but one and the same man can be good or bad. This feature points to a major ontological role that substance plays in Aristotle's scheme. It is the subject of change. Substance is the subject of change. And in fact, we'll see in other works of Aristotle that this plays a very important role in the way in which Aristotle uses substance. So substances are unique in that only they can receive contraries, and their ability to receive contraries is going to figure into his account of natural change. He says the only things comparable to substances in this respect are statements and beliefs, which can be true in one context and false in another. So, right, I mean, one can say, now it is night. And that statement is false in one context and true in another. I can write it down, leave it on the table, come back at 3 in the morning, and even though that statement is false now, it will be true at 3 in the morning. So statements are like that, but statements are like that because of facts which are extrinsic to them. It wasn't because anything changed in the statement, in an index card that I wrote now it is night on, that would just stay the same, but the context around it changed. Whereas substances can undergo change in themselves. And that is the important distinctive feature of substances. They can undergo change in themselves. So that's Aristotle's categories. This leads to a second discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an adequate justification for his privileging of individual creatures such as men and horses as primary substance? Does he provide a sufficiently clear criterion for distinguishing primary substance from other things? Do you agree with Aristotle that species and genera are properly thought of as secondary substances? Does the notion that beings in the various categories do not all possess the same degree of being, same degree of reality, but rather stand in a hierarchy of greater and lesser being make sense to you? Why or why not? So this is the second discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an adequate justification for his privileging of individual creatures such as men and horses as primary substance? Does he provide a sufficiently clear criterion for distinguishing primary substances from other things? Do you agree with Aristotle that species and genera are properly thought of as secondary substances? Does the notion that beings in the various categories do not all possess the same degree of reality, but rather stand in a hierarchy of greater and lesser reality make sense to you? Why or why not?